The rain fell with that peculiar persistence which seems to mark the most trying days of one's existence. Each droplet a small reminder of life's tendency toward the inconvenient. Eleanor Hartwell adjusted her sodden delivery cap and pressed the buzzer of the gleaming glass tower that housed Meridian Technologies, her breath forming small clouds in the November air. The weight of the insulated bag pressed against her shoulder, its contents, what appeared to be nothing more than the lunch orders of those who dwelt in the rarefied atmosphere of the 32nd floor, seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. She had been delivering food to this particular edifice for the better part of 18 months, yet never had she ventured beyond the marble-clad lobby with its towering arrangements of orchids and its security desk manned by individuals whose uniforms appeared more costly than her entire wardrobe. Today, however, circumstances had conspired to alter this familiar pattern. The usual receptionist, a woman of middle years whose manner suggested she considered food delivery persons to be somewhat beneath her notice, was absent, and in her place sat a young man whose expression bore the harried look of one thrust into unfamiliar territory. "Miss Hartwell," he ventured, consulting a tablet with the sort of reverent attention one might reserve for ancient scripture. "There's been a change in the delivery instructions. You're to proceed directly to the executive conference room on the 32nd floor." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise, though she maintained that composure which had served her well through countless encounters with the dismissive and the disdainful. "The executive conference room?" she repeated, her voice carrying a note of inquiry rather than protest. "Indeed," the young man confirmed, his fingers dancing across the tablet surface. "Mr. Blackstone himself has requested your presence. Something about a special delivery challenge." He paused, regarding her with an expression that mingled curiosity with a kind of sympathetic bewilderment. "The elevators are just there, miss. 32nd floor, turn left." As the elevator ascended with that smooth, nearly silent progress which marked all things within this temple to technology and commerce, Eleanor found herself reflecting upon the curious turns her life had taken. 6 years prior, she'd been Eleanor Hartwell, doctoral candidate in computer science at Columbia University, her dissertation on quantum algorithms showing promising signs of breakthrough work. That was before her father's illness had consumed their family's modest savings, before the crushing weight of medical bills had forced her to abandon her studies and seek whatever employment might keep their small apartment and put food upon their table. The delivery work had been meant as a temporary measure, a bridge to carry her across the difficult months until circumstances improved. Yet circumstances, as she had learned, possess a stubborn tendency to resist improvement, and the months had stretched into years. Still, she told herself, as the elevator's digital display climbed steadily upward, she had not allowed her mind to grow idle. Her evenings were not spent caring for her father or managing the endless paperwork that seems to multiply around illness like some particularly virulent species of bureaucratic fungus, were devoted to maintaining her skills, to following the latest developments in her field, to solving the sort of complex problems that had once filled her days in the university's computer laboratories. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, its walls lined with what appeared to be original artwork, and its floors covered in carpeting so thick that her footsteps made no sound. The air itself seemed different here, cooler, somehow purer, as though it had been specially prepared for the consumption of those whose salaries contained more digits than Eleanor cared to contemplate. She turned left as instructed and found herself approaching a set of double doors that stood partially ajar. From within came the sound of voices, male voices for the most part, engaged in what appeared to be animated discussion. As she drew nearer, fragments of conversation reached her ears, words like algorithm and optimization and computational complexity floating out like half-remembered melodies from a life she had once known intimately. "Ah, our refreshments have arrived," called a voice from within as she appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor found herself the object of a dozen pairs of eyes, each regarding her with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to barely concealed amusement. The room itself was a monument to corporate success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that stretched to the horizon, a conference table of gleaming mahogany around which were arranged chairs that likely cost more than Eleanor earned in a month, and walls adorned with awards and photographs depicting the company's various triumphs. At the head of the table sat a man whom Eleanor recognized, despite never having seen him in person, as Marcus Blackstone, the founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies. His photograph graced the pages of business magazines with sufficient regularity that his features, the sharp cheekbones, the steel-grey eyes, the hair that remained stubbornly dark despite his 40-some years, had become familiar to anyone who followed the technology industry even casually. He regarded her now with an expression that seemed to combine assessment with something that might have been amusement. "Miss Hartwell," he said, rising from his chair with a fluid grace that spoke of both natural athleticism and the sort of supreme confidence that comes with commanding a fortune measured in the hundreds of millions. "Thank you for joining us. I trust the journey up was not too arduous." Eleanor set down her delivery bag with practiced efficiency, though she could not help but notice the way the assembled company, for she could see now that they were all men, all bearing the particular pallor and slightly rumpled appearance of those who spent their days before computer screens, watched this simple action with the sort of attention usually reserved for theatrical performances. "Not at all, Mr. Blackstone," she replied, her voice carrying just enough formality to acknowledge his position while maintaining her own dignity. "Though I must confess some curiosity as to why the usual protocol has been altered." A ripple of what might have been surprised laughter passed through the room, and Eleanor caught the exchange of glances between several of the assembled programmers. One of them, a young man with the sort of carefully cultivated stubble that suggested considerable attention to appearing carelessly groomed, leaned back in his chair with an expression of theatrical skepticism. "Did you hear that, gentlemen?" he said, his voice pitched to carry a note of condescending amusement. "Curiosity about protocol from a delivery girl." The emphasis he placed upon these final words left little doubt as to his opinion of both her profession and her presumption in questioning the arrangements made by her betters. Eleanor felt that familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied such moments, the sensation of being weighed and found wanting by those who knew nothing of her circumstances or her capabilities. Yet she had long ago learned the futility of allowing such reactions to show upon her face. Instead, she maintained that expression of polite attention which had served her well in countless similar encounters. "Perhaps," suggested another of the programmers, this one possessed of the sort of thin, angular frame that suggested a diet consisting primarily of energy drinks and whatever food could be consumed without requiring him to step away from his workstation. "We should explain to our guest the nature of today's entertainment." Mr. Blackstone raised a hand, and the room fell silent with a speed that spoke volumes about the respect or perhaps fear in which he was held. "Indeed, gentlemen, let us not keep Miss Hartwell in suspense." He gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of the table, its position clearly indicating its intended occupant's place in the room's hierarchy. "Please have a seat. I believe you will find what we have to discuss illuminating." Eleanor approached the indicated chair with measured steps, conscious of the weight of observation upon her. As she settled into the leather seat, which was, she noted, every bit as comfortable as its appearance suggested, Mr. Blackstone resumed his position at the table's head and regarded her with those calculating grey eyes. "You have been delivering food to our offices for some time now," he began, his voice carrying the sort of measured cadence that suggested careful consideration of each word. "In that capacity, you have no doubt observed something of our operations, our culture, our personnel." His gaze swept the assembled programmers, and Eleanor caught something in his expression that suggested his assessment of his employees might not be entirely flattering. "I have observed," Eleanor replied carefully, "that Meridian Technologies appears to be a place where talented individuals are provided with the resources to pursue complex technical challenges." Another exchange of glances passed between the programmers, this one accompanied by barely suppressed snickers. The one with the carefully maintained stubble, who had, Eleanor noted, not troubled to introduce himself, shook his head with exaggerated dismay. "Talented individuals," he repeated, as though the words themselves were somehow amusing, "pursuing complex technical challenges." He looked around the table with the expression of one sharing a private joke with intimate friends. "I suppose that's one way to describe what we do here." Mr. Blackstone's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained level. "What Mr. Davidson means to say," he said, and Eleanor filed away the name for future reference, "is that the work we do here requires a particular combination of technical skill, creative thinking, and problem-solving ability that is not universally distributed among the population." Eleanor nodded, maintaining her expression of polite attention while mentally noting that Mr. Davidson appeared to be precisely the sort of individual who confused technical competence with general intelligence, a confusion she had encountered with depressing frequency during her academic career. "Which brings us," Mr. Blackstone continued, "to today's unusual arrangement." He reached into a briefcase that sat beside his chair and withdrew a tablet, its screen already glowing with what appeared to be lines of code. "We find ourselves in the interesting position of having developed a problem that has proven resistant to solution by conventional means." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, the earlier amusement giving way to something more focused, more intense. Eleanor sensed that whatever was to come represented more than mere entertainment for the assembled company. "A challenge," said another of the programmers, this one older than his colleagues and possessed of the sort of prematurely grey hair that suggested long nights spent wrestling with stubborn algorithms. "A coding challenge that has been circulating through the tech industry for the past several months. No one has solved it yet." "No one in the industry," Mr. Davidson corrected with obvious relish. "Though of course that's hardly surprising. It requires a level of mathematical sophistication that—" He paused, regarding Eleanor with renewed amusement. "Well, let's just say it's not the sort of thing one encounters in the food service sector." Mr. Blackstone set the tablet down on the table with a soft click that somehow managed to command attention. "The challenge," he said, "involves the development of an algorithm capable of optimizing resource allocation across a distributed network under conditions of dynamic constraint modification. The mathematical foundations draw upon concepts from graph theory, linear programming, and quantum computation." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, though she was careful not to allow this reaction to show upon her face. The problem description, while couched in the sort of technical language designed to intimidate the uninitiated, was in fact remarkably similar to the theoretical framework she had been developing for her abandoned dissertation. "Fascinating," she said, her voice carrying just enough interest to seem polite without appearing presumptuous. Mr. Davidson laughed outright at this response. "Fascinating," he repeated mockingly. "I'm sure it is. Though I suspect the finer points of quantum algorithmic optimization might be somewhat beyond me," Eleanor interrupted gently, and something in her tone caused the laughter to die in Mr. Davidson's throat. "You may be right, of course. I am, as you have so kindly pointed out, merely a delivery girl." The silence that followed this exchange was of that particular quality that suggests the assembled company has suddenly realized they may have misjudged their situation. Mr. Blackstone, Eleanor noted, was regarding her with considerably more attention than he had previously displayed. "However," she continued, her voice maintaining its pleasant conversational tone, "I find myself curious about the specific parameters of the problem. Are we dealing with static network topology, or does the algorithm need to account for dynamic restructuring? And when you mention quantum computation, are we talking about actual quantum hardware implementation or merely quantum-inspired classical algorithms? The effect of these questions upon the assembled programmers was immediate and unmistakable. The casual arrogance that had characterized their earlier interactions gave way to something approaching wariness, and more than one pair of eyes narrowed as they reassessed the woman sitting at the far end of their conference table. Mr. Blackstone leaned forward slightly, his expression one of genuine interest. "Those are remarkably sophisticated questions, Miss Hartwell. Might I ask what background you have in computer science?" Eleanor considered her response carefully. The truth was complicated, tangled up with circumstances that these men, secure in their positions and their salaries, might struggle to understand. Yet something in Mr. Blackstone's tone suggested that this might be the moment for honesty, regardless of its complications. "I was a doctoral candidate at Columbia," she said simply. "Computer science, with a focus on quantum algorithms for optimization problems. I was compelled to leave before completing my degree due to family circumstances." The silence that greeted this revelation was profound. Eleanor could see the programmers exchanging glances, their earlier amusement replaced by something that might have been embarrassment, or perhaps merely confusion at having their assumptions so thoroughly overturned. Mr. Davidson, however, appeared unwilling to abandon his position so easily. "A doctoral candidate," he said, though his tone had lost much of its earlier certainty. "Well, that's impressive, I suppose. Though there's quite a difference between academic theory and practical application. The real world has a way of humbling those who think they understand complex systems based solely on textbook learning." Eleanor smiled, and there was something in that smile that caused Mr. Davidson to shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You're absolutely correct," she said. "There is indeed a substantial difference between theory and practice, which is why I've spent the past 6 years supplementing my theoretical background with practical experience in systems optimization." "Practical experience?" one of the other programmers asked, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "In systems optimization, while working as a delivery driver?" "Precisely because I work as a delivery driver," Eleanor replied. "Do you suppose that the efficient routing of delivery vehicles across an urban environment, accounting for traffic patterns, construction delays, fuel consumption, customer time preferences, and vehicle capacity constraints, is a simple problem? Or that the real-time optimization of such routes in response to changing conditions requires anything less than sophisticated algorithmic approaches?" The uncomfortable shifting that had begun with Mr. Davidson now spread to encompass the entire table. Eleanor could see the recognition dawning in their eyes, the realization that they had allowed their prejudices to blind them to possibilities that should have been obvious. Mr. Blackstone, however, appeared delighted by this turn of events. He clasped his hands together and regarded Eleanor with the expression of one who has discovered an unexpectedly valuable artifact in what had appeared to be ordinary debris. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I believe you may be exactly what we need. The challenge I mentioned, it comes with a prize, a substantial prize, both financial and professional. The first person to provide a working solution will receive not only a cash award of $50,000, but also a position as senior algorithm developer with Meridian Technologies, at a salary commensurate with such expertise." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, though she managed to maintain her composure. $50,000 would not only clear her family's remaining medical debts, but provide enough security to allow her father to receive the sort of care that had previously been beyond their means. And a senior position at a company like Meridian. It was more than she had dared to hope for during the darkest moments of the past 6 years. "However," Mr. Blackstone continued, and Eleanor heard the note of challenge in his voice, "there is a condition. The solution must be developed here, in this room, within the next 4 hours. No external resources, no internet access, no consultation with outside parties. Just you, the problem, and your ability to solve it. All of us have tried, said the grey-haired programmer, his voice carrying a note of what might have been respect. We've been working on variations of this problem for months. Some of the brightest minds in the industry have examined it. If you think you can succeed where we have failed, I think, Eleanor said quietly, that perhaps a fresh perspective might prove valuable. Different experiences, different approaches. Sometimes these can reveal solutions that have been hidden by the very expertise that should make them obvious. Mr. Davidson snorted derisively. A fresh perspective, he repeated, from someone who delivers sandwiches for a living. Eleanor turned to face him directly, and there was something in her gaze that made him lean back involuntarily in his chair. "Mr. Davidson," she said, her voice carrying a note of steel beneath its continued politeness, "I suspect you are about to learn something about the danger of underestimating people based on their current circumstances rather than their capabilities." Mr. Blackston stood, moving to a whiteboard that occupied much of one wall. "Gentlemen," he said, "I propose we make this interesting. Miss Hartwell will have the opportunity to attempt the challenge, but she will not work in isolation. Each of you will also continue your own efforts to solve the problem. Whoever produces the first working solution, Miss Hartwell or any of the 9 programmers currently employed by this company, will claim the prize." The competitive atmosphere that had been simmering beneath the surface of their interactions now burst into the open. Eleanor could see the calculations taking place behind the eyes of each programmer, the assessment of their chances, the consideration of what $50,000 and a promotion might mean for their careers. "And, to make things even more interesting," Mr. Blackston added, moving to the conference table and producing 9 additional tablets from his briefcase, "we'll work with a modified version of the problem, one that incorporates additional constraints I developed just this morning. None of you have seen these particular parameters before." He handed a tablet to each programmer, then returned to Eleanor with the final device. As she accepted it, their eyes met, and she saw something there that surprised her. Not the condescension or amusement she had come to expect, but something that looked remarkably like respect. "The clock begins now," he announced, settling back into his chair with the expression of one preparing to observe a particularly interesting experiment. 4 hours to solve a problem that has stymied some of the most talented programmers in the industry. May the best mind win. Eleanor looked down at the tablet's screen, where lines of code and mathematical expressions were already beginning to coalesce into a picture of the challenge before her. Around the table, the programmers had bent to their own devices, their earlier amusement replaced by the intense focus of individuals who suddenly realized they might be facing more formidable competition than they had anticipated. As she began to read through the problem specifications, Eleanor felt a familiar sensation, the tightening of focus, the sharpening of mental acuity that had once been as natural to her as breathing. For the first time in 6 years, she was being asked not to deliver someone else's solutions, but to create her own. The problem that materialized before Eleanor's eyes possessed that particular elegance which marks truly sophisticated mathematical challenges, deceptively simple in its initial presentation, yet revealing layer upon layer of complexity as one delved deeper into its requirements. The fundamental task appeared straightforward enough: design an algorithm capable of distributing computational resources across a network of servers, each with varying capacities and specializations, in response to a stream of incoming requests with different priority levels and processing requirements. Yet as Eleanor's trained eye moved through the specifications, she began to perceive the subtle malevolence that lurked beneath this apparently routine optimization problem. The constraints were numerous, and more troublingly, they were dynamic. The network topology could change without warning as servers went offline or came back into service. The priority levels of requests could shift based on external factors that the algorithm would need to predict rather than simply respond to. Most challenging of all, the system needed to maintain optimal performance while operating under conditions of incomplete information, making decisions based on probabilistic assessments rather than certain knowledge. Around her, the soft clicking of keyboards had begun to fill the conference room as the 9 programmers bent themselves to the task. Eleanor could sense the intensity of their focus, the way their breathing had become shallow and rapid as they encountered the same realization that was now crystallizing in her own mind. This was not merely a coding challenge, but a test of one's ability to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to hold complex mathematical relationships in perfect balance while accounting for variables that existed in a constant state of flux. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the familiar ritual of mental preparation to wash over her. It had been too long since she had engaged with a problem of this caliber. Too long since she had been permitted to exercise the full range of her intellectual capabilities. The sensation was rather like stretching muscles that had been held too long in one position, painful at first, but followed by a rush of relief as circulation returned to areas that had been deprived. When she opened her eyes again, Eleanor found herself looking not at the tablet's screen, but at the faces of her competitors. Mr. Davidson had already begun typing furiously, his expression one of grim determination. The grey-haired programmer, whose name she had not yet learned, was making notes on a piece of paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. Others were staring at their screens with varying degrees of bewilderment, and she could almost see the moment when each of them encountered the problem's true complexity. Mr. Blackstone, she noted, was watching not the programmers, but her, his grey eyes alert with curiosity. When their gazes met, he offered her the slightest of nods, acknowledgement perhaps, or encouragement. She could not be certain which, but found herself oddly grateful for either. Eleanor turned her attention back to the tablet and began to work in earnest. The first step, she knew, was to understand not merely what the problem was asking, but what it was truly testing. In her experience, the most elegant solutions often emerged from recognizing that the apparent challenge masked a deeper, more fundamental question. The resource allocation aspect was, she realized after several minutes of careful analysis, something of a red herring. Yes, the algorithm would need to distribute computational tasks efficiently, but that was merely the surface layer of the challenge. The true difficulty lay in the prediction component. The system's need to anticipate changes in network topology, request patterns, and priority hierarchies based on limited historical data and real-time observations. This was, in essence, a problem of pattern recognition under uncertainty, complicated by the need to maintain optimal performance even when the patterns themselves were evolving. It required not just computational efficiency, but a kind of mathematical intuition that could perceive order within apparent chaos. Eleanor began to sketch out her approach, her fingers moving across the tablet's surface with increasing confidence. The solution, she believed, lay in treating the network not as a static structure to be optimized, but as a dynamic system whose behavior could be modeled using principles borrowed from quantum mechanics. Specifically, the mathematics of superposition and probability wave functions. "Interesting," murmured a voice beside her, and Eleanor looked up to find that one of the younger programmers, a man with prematurely thinning hair and the sort of intense concentration that suggested either genius or obsession, had leaned over to glance at her work. "Are you approaching this as a quantum optimization problem?" Eleanor considered her response carefully. In academic settings, she had learned, collaboration often proved more valuable than competition. Yet the circumstances here were different, and she was keenly aware that $50,000 and a professional opportunity hung in the balance. "I'm exploring several approaches," she replied diplomatically. "The quantum perspective offers certain advantages, particularly in handling uncertainty and superposition states. but it's only one possible framework. The young man nodded thoughtfully. I'm Peterson, by the way, James Peterson. He extended a hand, which Eleanor shook briefly. I have to admit, when Davidson was making his comments earlier, I assumed incorrectly. Your background is clearly more substantial than any of us realized. Assumptions, Eleanor observed, returning to her work, have a way of revealing more about those who make them than about their subjects. Peterson laughed softly. Fair point, though I suspect we're all about to be educated in ways we didn't anticipate. As the first hour passed, Eleanor found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of deep mathematical work. The conference room around her seemed to fade into background noise, the clicking of keyboards, the occasional muttered curse or exclamation of frustration, the sound of Mr. Blackstone's pen scratching across paper as he made notes on their progress. Her approach was beginning to coalesce into something concrete. By modeling the network as a quantum system, she could represent each server's state as a probability distribution rather than a fixed set of parameters. This allowed the algorithm to maintain multiple possible configurations simultaneously, collapsing into specific resource allocations only when actual requests arrived, and forced the system to make definitive choices. The elegance of this approach lay in its inherent adaptability. Rather than trying to predict the future state of the network with certainty, an impossible task given the dynamic constraints, the algorithm could prepare for multiple possible futures simultaneously, shifting probability weights based on observed patterns while maintaining optimal performance across all likely scenarios. Having trouble with the predictive modeling? Asked Mr. Davidson, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested he believed himself to be making superior progress. It's a common stumbling point. The mathematics involved are quite advanced. Eleanor glanced up from her work to find Davidson looking at her with renewed condescension, though she noted that his earlier casual arrogance had been replaced by something more pointed, more deliberate. He had, she realized, been unsettled by her demonstration of technical competence and was now attempting to reassert his sense of superiority through direct challenge. The predictive modeling is indeed complex, she agreed pleasantly, though I find that the key lies in recognizing when prediction itself is the wrong approach. Sometimes it's more effective to prepare for multiple possibilities than to attempt certainty where none exists. Davidson's expression faltered slightly. Multiple possibilities, he repeated slowly. You mean like a branching algorithm? Because that's computationally intensive to the point of impracticality. The processing overhead alone would be manageable, Eleanor interrupted gently, if one approached the branching through quantum superposition rather than classical computation. The mathematical framework allows for simultaneous evaluation of probability, states without the exponential scaling issues that plague traditional branching approaches. The silence that greeted this explanation was profound. Eleanor could see the other programmers looking up from their work, their attention now focused on the exchange between herself and Davidson. Even Mr. Blackstone had stopped writing, his pen suspended above his notepad as he listened to their conversation. Quantum superposition, Davidson said, his voice now carrying a note of uncertainty. In a classical computing environment, that's theoretical, academic. It can't be implemented on actual hardware. Eleanor smiled, and there was something in that smile that made several of the watching programmers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Mr. Davidson, she said, I think you may be confusing quantum computing hardware with quantum-inspired algorithms. The mathematical principles of superposition can be adapted for classical systems through proper use of probability matrices and wave function approximations. The computational overhead is actually quite reasonable, provided one structures the calculations correctly. She turned her tablet around, showing Davidson her work. The screen displayed a complex array of mathematical expressions, interwoven with lines of code that seemed to dance between pure mathematics and practical implementation. The key, she continued, lies in recognizing that we don't need actual quantum hardware to benefit from quantum mathematical principles. We simply need to model our probability distributions as quantum states and allow the algorithm to collapse these states into specific decisions when circumstances require it. Peterson had moved closer now, studying Eleanor's work with obvious fascination. "This is brilliant," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "You're essentially creating a classical implementation of quantum uncertainty principles. The system can exist in multiple states simultaneously until forced to choose, at which point it selects the optimal configuration based on real-time data." "Exactly," Eleanor replied, gratified to encounter someone who grasped the implications of her approach immediately. "It allows the algorithm to be simultaneously prepared for multiple scenarios while maintaining computational efficiency." Davidson was staring at the tablet's screen with an expression that combined confusion with something that might have been panic. "I don't understand," he said, though his tone suggested that he was beginning to understand all too well. "This is graduate-level theoretical work. You're a delivery driver. How do I understand concepts that you apparently find challenging?" Eleanor asked, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone despite the edge that had crept into her words. "Perhaps because I spent several years studying exactly these types of problems before circumstances forced me into my current profession. Or perhaps because delivering food efficiently across a complex urban environment has given me practical experience with optimization problems that you've only encountered in abstract form." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor could see the recognition dawning in the faces around her, the realization that they had not merely underestimated her capabilities, but had done so in a manner that reflected poorly on their own judgment and character. Mr. Blackstone cleared his throat softly, drawing attention back to himself. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a note of reproof, "perhaps we might focus on the work at hand rather than debating credentials. Miss Hartwell's approach appears promising, but the proof, as they say, will be in the implementation." Eleanor nodded gratefully and returned to her work, though she was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere in the room. Where before there had been casual dismissal, now there was wariness, and in some cases, what appeared to be genuine respect. She realized, crossed some invisible threshold. She was no longer the delivery girl who had wandered accidentally into their world. She was a competitor, and a formidable one. As the second hour began, Eleanor's algorithm started to take concrete shape. The quantum-inspired probability matrices were proving as elegant in practice as they had been in theory, providing the system with exactly the kind of flexible responsiveness that the problem demanded. She had managed to create a structure that could adapt to changing conditions without sacrificing computational efficiency, maintaining optimal performance even under the most challenging circumstances outlined in the problem's specification. Around her, she could sense growing frustration from several of the programmers. Mr. Davidson had abandoned his original approach and was now attempting to implement something that bore a suspicious resemblance to Eleanor's quantum-inspired framework, though his lack of familiarity with the underlying mathematics was proving to be a significant obstacle. Others were struggling with different aspects of the challenge, their initial confidence giving way to the sort of desperate determination that comes with the recognition that one's reputation may be at stake. Peterson, however, had taken a different approach. Rather than competing directly with Eleanor's solution, he appeared to be developing a complementary algorithm that might serve as a backup system for her primary framework. When she glanced over at his work, she found herself impressed by the sophistication of his approach. "Interesting strategy," she observed quietly. "You're creating a hybrid system that can switch between optimization approaches based on network conditions." Peterson nodded, not looking up from his work. "Your quantum framework is elegant, but it requires certain assumptions about data availability and network stability. I'm building something that could serve as a fallback when those assumptions break down." He paused, finally meeting her eyes. I figure if I can't beat you, maybe I can complement you. Depending on how Mr. Blackstone evaluates the solutions, collaborative approaches might have value. Eleanor felt a surge of respect for Peterson's practical wisdom. In abandoning the zero-sum competitive mindset that seemed to dominate his colleagues, he had identified an approach that might benefit them both. More importantly, he had recognized the genuine merit in her work and chosen to build upon it rather than tear it down out of wounded pride. "That's remarkably mature thinking," she said. "In my academic experience, the best solutions often emerged from collaboration rather than competition." "Well," Peterson replied with a slight smile, "I suspect my colleagues are about to learn something about the value of keeping an open mind." As if summoned by these words, Mr. Davidson's voice rose from across the table in obvious frustration. "This is ridiculous," he declared, pushing back from his tablet with enough force to make his chair scrape against the floor. "I've been working with optimization algorithms for 8 years. I have 2 degrees and multiple industry certifications. I am not going to be shown up by someone who delivers lunch for a living." The silence that followed this outburst was of the sort that seems to stretch infinitely, filled with unspoken judgments and uncomfortable realizations. Eleanor looked up from her work to find every eye in the room focused on Davidson, who appeared to have realized that his words had revealed more about his character than he had intended. Mr. Blackstone's expression had turned positively glacial. "Mr. Davidson," he said, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made everyone in the room straighten involuntarily, "I believe you may have forgotten where you are and who you represent. This company's success has always been built upon respect for talent and capability, regardless of its source. If you find yourself unable to maintain professional standards—" "No, sir," Davidson interrupted hastily, his face flushing red. "I apologize. I didn't mean I was frustrated with the problem, not with, I mean—" "What you meant," Eleanor said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the room, "was exactly what you said. You cannot conceive of the possibility that someone in my current circumstances might possess capabilities that exceed your own, and rather than examine your assumptions or learn from the experience, you would prefer to attribute your difficulties to some fundamental unfairness in the universe." Davidson opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor continued before he could speak. "The tragedy, Mr. Davidson, is not that you've encountered someone who challenges your preconceptions about talent and intelligence. The tragedy is that you've chosen to respond to that challenge by diminishing yourself rather than rising to meet it." She paused, studying his face with an expression that might have been pity. "I suspect you are capable of far more than you're currently demonstrating. Perhaps if you spent less energy protecting your ego and more energy solving the actual problem, you might surprise yourself with what you could accomplish." The quiet that followed these words was broken only by the soft sound of keyboards as the other programmers returned to their work, each seeming eager to avoid further involvement in Davidson's humiliation. Eleanor, too, turned back to her tablet, though she remained acutely aware of the changed dynamics in the room. Mr. Blackstone, she noted, was watching her with an expression of what appeared to be approval, and perhaps something more complex. A recognition perhaps of qualities that extended beyond mere technical competence. She had handled Davidson's outburst with exactly the sort of grace and authority that he himself might have employed, diffusing the situation while making her position absolutely clear. As the 3rd hour began, Eleanor's algorithm entered its final phase of development. The quantum-inspired framework was working exactly as she had envisioned, providing the system with the flexibility and adaptability that the problem demanded. More importantly, her solution was proving to be not only theoretically elegant, but practically implementable, with computational requirements that remained well within reasonable bounds, even under the most challenging scenarios. She realized, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, very close to success. The 3rd hour brought with it that peculiar intensity which marks the approach of either triumph or catastrophe. Eleanor could feel the weight of approaching completion in her algorithm, the way the disparate components were beginning to coalesce into a unified whole that possessed the elegant simplicity which often characterizes truly sophisticated solutions. Yet she was equally aware of the scrutiny focused upon her from every corner of the conference room, the way her competitors watched her progress with expressions that ranged from grudging admiration to barely concealed hostility. The quantum-inspired framework was performing beautifully in her simulations, adapting to changes in network topology with a fluidity that surprised even her. She had implemented a series of probability cascades that allowed the system to maintain optimal resource allocation even when multiple servers went offline simultaneously, while her predictive algorithms were successfully identifying pattern shifts in request priorities with remarkable accuracy. "Remarkable work," murmured Peterson from beside her, his own solution having evolved into something that complemented her primary algorithm with impressive sophistication. "Your probability matrices are handling the uncertainty parameters better than anything I've seen. The way you've structured the quantum state representations is genuinely innovative." Eleanor glanced up from her tablet to acknowledge his comment, and in doing so caught sight of Mr. Davidson's workstation. What she observed there caused her a moment of genuine surprise, not because his work was poor, but because it was considerably better than she had expected given his earlier outburst. He had, she realized, abandoned his attempts to replicate her quantum approach and had instead developed a more traditional optimization algorithm that nonetheless displayed genuine sophistication in its handling of the dynamic constraint parameters. "Mr. Davidson," she said quietly, causing him to look up from his screen with an expression of wariness, "your constraint handling mechanism is quite elegant. The way you've structured the priority queuing system shows real insight into the problem's underlying architecture." Davidson's expression shifted through several stages of confusion before settling on something that might have been cautious gratitude. You think so?" he asked, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance. "I mean, it's not as sophisticated as your quantum approach, but I thought perhaps the classical implementation might have certain advantages in terms of predictability and maintenance." "Indeed it might," Eleanor agreed. "Different approaches often reveal different aspects of a problem's solution space. Your focus on maintainability is quite practical. Quantum-inspired algorithms can be challenging for traditional development teams to modify and debug. The effect of this exchange upon the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Several of the other programmers looked up from their work with expressions of surprise, as though they had not expected to witness such civility between competitors. More importantly, Davidson's posture had changed, his defensive hostility replaced by something approaching professional engagement. "Perhaps," suggested Peterson with obvious diplomatic intent, "we might benefit from examining our different approaches collaboratively, not to compromise our individual solutions, but to ensure we're all considering the full range of optimization possibilities." Mr. Blackstone, who had been observing this exchange with obvious interest, raised an eyebrow. "An intriguing suggestion, Mr. Peterson. Though I should point out that the challenge was designed to identify individual excellence rather than collaborative achievement." "With respect, sir," Eleanor interjected, "I believe Mr. Peterson raises an important point about the nature of excellence itself. In my academic experience, the most significant breakthroughs often emerge from the intersection of different perspectives rather than from isolated genius." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Moreover, if the goal is to identify individuals capable of contributing to Meridian Technologies' continued success, surely the ability to collaborate effectively and learn from others represents a valuable qualification in its own right." The silence that followed this observation was profound, and Eleanor could see Mr. Blackstone weighing her words with the sort of careful attention that suggested they had struck home. Around the table, several of the programmers were nodding thoughtfully, their competitive focus beginning to give way to curiosity about their colleagues' approaches. "Very well," Mr. Blackstone said finally. "Let us have a brief intermission. 5 minutes for each of you to present your current progress to the group, not to reveal trade secrets, but to demonstrate your thinking processes and analytical approaches." What followed was perhaps the most educational 25 minutes Eleanor had experienced since her departure from Columbia University. Each programmer's presentation revealed not only their technical approach, but their fundamental philosophy toward problem-solving, their strengths and limitations, their capacity for clear communication and analytical thinking. Mr. Davidson's presentation, she was pleased to note, revealed genuine competence when stripped of its earlier arrogance. His classical optimization approach was indeed sophisticated, and his focus on maintainability and debugging represented practical considerations that her more theoretical framework might have overlooked. When he finished his explanation, Eleanor made a point of commenting thoughtfully on the elegance of his priority queuing system, earning her a look of surprised gratitude. Peterson's hybrid approach proved even more impressive than she had initially realized. He had not simply created a backup system for her quantum framework, but had developed an entirely new methodology for switching between optimization strategies based on real-time network analysis. His presentation was clear, methodical, and demonstrated exactly the sort of systematic thinking that made for exceptional software architecture. The other programmers revealed varying degrees of competence and insight. Some had developed interesting partial solutions that addressed specific aspects of the challenge with genuine creativity. Others had become mired in approaches that, while technically sound, lacked the flexibility needed to handle the problem's dynamic requirements. When Eleanor's turn came, she found herself facing an audience whose attention was focused with laser-like intensity. She had, she realized, become the standard against which the others were measuring themselves, and the weight of their expectations was both thrilling and daunting. "My approach," she began, her voice carrying the clear, measured cadence that had served her well during countless academic presentations, is based on the recognition that this problem requires us to maintain optimal performance under conditions of fundamental uncertainty. Rather than attempting to predict the future state of our network with impossible precision, I've chosen to prepare for multiple possible futures simultaneously. She turned her tablet screen toward the group, revealing the complex mathematical framework that underpinned her algorithm. By modeling our resource allocation system as a quantum-inspired probability matrix, we can represent each server's potential states as superposition functions rather than fixed parameters. This allows the algorithm to maintain multiple optimization strategies in parallel, collapsing into specific resource assignments only when actual requests force the system to make definitive choices. The questions that followed her presentation were both numerous and sophisticated, revealing that her audience possessed a deeper understanding of the underlying concepts than their earlier behavior might have suggested. Davidson, in particular, asked several probing questions about the computational overhead of maintaining probability matrices, questions that demonstrated he had been listening carefully and thinking seriously about the practical implications of her approach. "The elegance of your framework is undeniable," said the grey-haired programmer, whom she had learned was named Richardson. "But I'm curious about error propagation. If your probability calculations become corrupted, say by hardware failures or network interruptions, how does the system recover?" Eleanor smiled, recognizing the question as one that went to the heart of her algorithm's robustness. "An excellent point, Mr. Richardson. I've implemented what I call probability checkpoints, periodic states where the system collapses all superposition functions into concrete configurations, essentially creating restore points that allow recovery from various types of corruption." The frequency of these checkpoints can be adjusted based on network stability, trading some computational efficiency for increased reliability when conditions become unstable. The admiration in Richardson's eyes was unmistakable. "Brilliant," he said simply. "That addresses my primary concern about quantum-inspired approaches, their tendency toward fragility in real-world implementations." As the presentations concluded and they returned to their individual work, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken. What had begun as a confrontational challenge between herself and 9 dismissive programmers had evolved into something approaching genuine collaboration. Not in the sense that they were working together directly, the competitive structure remained intact, but in the sense that they were now engaging with each other as equals, sharing insights and learning from different perspectives. The transformation in Mr. Davidson's behavior was particularly striking. Where earlier he had been defensive and condescending, he now approached her with questions and observations that demonstrated both respect for her capabilities and genuine curiosity about her methods. When she offered a suggestion about optimizing his priority queuing algorithm, he listened carefully and implemented her recommendation with gracious acknowledgement. "You know," he said during one such exchange, "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unprofessional, and more than that, it was stupid. I allowed my assumptions to blind me to your obvious qualifications, and then compounded the error by responding defensively instead of learning from the experience." Eleanor looked up from her work, studying Davidson's face for signs of insincerity and finding none. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "Though I hope you'll remember this lesson in future encounters. Talent and intelligence appear in unexpected places, often among people whose circumstances don't immediately advertise their capabilities." "Point taken," Davidson replied. "I suppose I've been spending so much time in environments where credentials and positions serve as reliable proxies for competence that I forgot how misleading such proxies can be." "Not misleading," Eleanor corrected gently. "Simply incomplete. Credentials and positions tell us something about a person's background and opportunities, but they tell us very little about their current capabilities or their potential for growth." As the 4th and final hour began, Eleanor's algorithm had reached a state that she could only describe as complete. Every component was functioning exactly as designed. The probability matrices were maintaining optimal performance under all test conditions, and the predictive algorithms were successfully identifying and adapting to pattern changes with remarkable accuracy. More importantly, she had implemented a series of diagnostic and monitoring systems that would allow the algorithm to assess its own performance continuously, identifying potential problems before they could impact system efficiency. The result was not merely an optimization algorithm, but a self-aware system capable of learning and adapting to new conditions without human intervention. "Finished?" asked Peterson, looking over at her tablet screen with obvious curiosity. "I believe so," Eleanor replied, though she continued to run simulation after simulation, searching for edge cases or failure modes that might have escaped her notice. "The core algorithm is complete and performing well under all test conditions. I'm now focused on validation and stress testing," Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "I'm approaching completion myself, though my solution is somewhat more conservative than yours. Less elegant perhaps, but possibly more predictable in its behavior." Around the table she could see other programmers in various stages of completion. Davidson appeared to be putting finishing touches on his classical optimization approach, while Richardson was still wrestling with what appeared to be a complex mathematical formulation. Several others seemed to have reached the limits of their capabilities, their expressions revealing the frustration of those who could perceive the solution they sought but could not quite reach it. Mr. Blackstone, she noted, had been making increasingly frequent notes as the afternoon progressed. His attention focused not merely on their technical progress, but on their interactions, their problem-solving approaches, their responses to stress and competition, This was, she realized, as much an evaluation of character and professional demeanor as it was a test of technical competence. With 15 minutes remaining, Eleanor made her final modifications to the algorithm, implementing a series of performance optimizations that should reduce computational overhead by approximately 12% while maintaining full functionality. She was, she believed, as ready as she could be. "Time!" called Mr. Blackstone, and the clicking of keyboards ceased abruptly throughout the room. "Gentlemen and lady, please save your work and prepare for demonstration." Eleanor saved her algorithm with fingers that remained remarkably steady, despite the magnitude of what she had accomplished. In 4 hours, she had not merely solved a problem that had stymied some of the industry's most talented programmers. She had done so with an approach that represented genuine innovation in the field of optimization algorithms. More than that, she had demonstrated to herself that the capabilities she had developed during her academic career had not merely survived her years of practical work, but had been enhanced by them. The theoretical framework she had learned at Columbia had been strengthened by her real-world experience with complex optimization problems, creating a hybrid perspective that proved more powerful than either pure theory or pure practice alone. "Miss Hartwell," said Mr. Blackstone, "perhaps you would be so kind as to demonstrate your solution first." Eleanor rose from her chair with the sort of quiet confidence that comes from knowing one has done excellent work. As she moved to the front of the room, connecting her tablet to the large display screen, she caught Peterson's encouraging nod and even a supportive gesture from Davidson. "Certainly, Mr. Blackstone," she replied, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent conference room. "I believe you'll find the results quite interesting." The large display screen, illuminated with Eleanor's algorithm, its elegant mathematical structures casting geometric shadows across the faces of the assembled programmers. What appeared before them was not merely code, but a work of art, each function flowing into the next with the sort of inevitable logic that marked truly inspired solutions. The quantum-inspired probability matrices seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, adapting and shifting as Eleanor's demonstration progressed through increasingly complex scenarios. "As you can see," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who knew precisely what they had accomplished, "the algorithm maintains optimal resource allocation even under conditions of extreme network volatility. Watch what happens when we simulate the simultaneous failure of 30% of our server capacity." She executed the command, and the room watched in fascination as her system absorbed the catastrophic loss without missing a beat. The probability matrices reconfigured themselves in real time, redistributing computational loads across the remaining servers while simultaneously preparing for multiple possible recovery scenarios. Within seconds, the network had stabilized at a new equilibrium point that achieved nearly 95% of its original efficiency despite the massive disruption. Peterson whistled softly under his breath. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The recovery time is almost instantaneous." "The key," Eleanor explained, "lies in the system's continuous preparation for multiple possible futures. Rather than waiting for failures to occur and then responding, the algorithm maintains contingency plans for various scenarios simultaneously. When a failure actually happens, the system simply collapses the appropriate probability functions into concrete actions." Mr. Blackstone leaned forward in his chair, his grey eyes fixed on the display with the intensity of a hunter observing prey. "Show me the computational overhead," he commanded. "What are the processing costs of maintaining these probability matrices?" Eleanor touched her tablet, and a new set of data appeared on the screen. Performance metrics that revealed her algorithm's resource consumption under various conditions. The numbers were, even she had to admit, impressive. Her quantum-inspired approach was achieving superior performance while consuming less computational resources than traditional optimization methods. The overhead is actually lower than classical approaches, she explained, because the probability matrices eliminate the need for complex branching calculations. Instead of computing multiple possible outcomes sequentially, the system maintains them simultaneously until circumstances force a specific choice. Davidson, who had been studying the performance data with obvious fascination, raised his hand tentatively. "I'm curious about scalability," he said, his earlier hostility completely absent from his voice. "How does the algorithm perform as network size increases?" Eleanor smiled, recognizing the question as one that went to the heart of practical implementation. "An excellent question, Mr. Davidson. Let me show you." She adjusted the parameters of her demonstration, scaling the network size from hundreds of servers to thousands, then tens of thousands. Throughout each scaling operation, her algorithm maintained its elegant performance characteristics, the probability matrices adapting seamlessly to increased complexity without suffering significant degradation. "The beauty of the quantum-inspired approach," she continued, "is that it scales logarithmically rather than exponentially. Each additional server increases the system's computational requirements by a nearly constant amount, regardless of the total network size." The silence that greeted this demonstration was profound. Eleanor could see the programmers exchanging glances, their expressions revealing a mixture of admiration and something that might have been professional envy. This was not merely a solution to the given problem. It was a breakthrough that could revolutionize how distributed computing systems handled resource allocation. Richardson cleared his throat softly. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying a note of what sounded remarkably like awe. "This is graduate-level research. This is the sort of work that gets published in premier academic journals. How long did you say you've been working on this approach?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "The theoretical foundation draws upon research I began during my doctoral studies 6 years ago," she replied. "But the practical implementation emerged this afternoon, informed by my experience with real-world optimization problems." "6 years ago," repeated Peterson thoughtfully, "which would make your original work somewhat ahead of its time. The quantum-inspired computing field was barely emerging then." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, "though I've always believed that the most interesting problems lie at the intersection of established fields rather than within their individual boundaries." Mr. Laxton stood slowly, his movement commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to invest the moment with unusual significance. "Your solution is not only correct, it is revolutionary. You have solved in 4 hours a problem that has challenged our industry for months, and you have done so with an approach that opens entirely new avenues for optimization research." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled programmers before returning to Eleanor. "However, fairness demands that we examine the other solutions before rendering final judgment. Gentlemen, please prepare your demonstrations." What followed was a series of presentations that revealed the genuine talent that resided within Meridian Technologies' programming staff. Davidson's classical optimization approach, while less innovative than Eleanor's quantum-inspired framework, demonstrated solid engineering principles and practical reliability. Peterson's hybrid system showed remarkable sophistication in its ability to switch between optimization strategies based on changing conditions. Richardson had developed an intriguing mathematical approach that, while incomplete, revealed insights into the problem's deeper structure. Yet as each demonstration concluded, it became increasingly clear that none of them had achieved what Eleanor had accomplished. Her solution was not merely superior, it was in a different category entirely, representing a qualitative leap forward in optimization methodology. When the final presentation ended, Mr. Blackstone returned to the front of the room, his expression thoughtful. "Gentlemen," he began, "you have all demonstrated competence and creativity in your approaches to this challenge. Several of your solutions represent solid engineering work that would serve our company well." He turned to face Eleanor directly. "However, Miss Hartwell has achieved something exceptional. Her solution is not merely correct, it is elegant, innovative, and scalable in ways that could transform how our industry approaches distributed optimization problems. The room fell silent, and Eleanor felt her heart beginning to race despite her efforts to maintain outward composure. This was the moment she had been working toward, consciously or not, for the past 6 years. The opportunity to reclaim her rightful place in the world of advanced technical work. Miss Hartwell, Mr. Blackstone continued, I am prepared to offer you not only the $50,000 prize, but the senior developer position we discussed, at a starting salary of $150,000 annually, with full benefits and equity participation. Eleanor felt the words wash over her like a physical force, their implications almost too large to grasp immediately. $150,000, more than 3 times what she currently earned in an entire year of delivery work. Full benefits that would ensure her father received the medical care he needed without the crushing financial burden that had dominated their lives for so long. And beyond the immediate practical considerations, the restoration of her professional identity, the opportunity to engage once again with the kind of complex problems that had always been her greatest passion. However, Mr. Blackstone continued, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the word, I have a proposition that might interest you even more. He moved to stand beside her, his expression serious. What you have accomplished today suggests capabilities that extend well beyond software development, however senior the position. I would like to offer you the opportunity to head our new Advanced Algorithms Research Division, reporting directly to me with a mandate to explore exactly the sort of innovative approaches you demonstrated today. Eleanor's mind reeled. A research division of her own with the resources of a major technology company behind her work. It was more than she had dared to imagine, even during her most optimistic moments at Columbia. The salary would be $200,000 annually to start, Mr. Blackstone continued, with substantial performance bonuses tied to successful research outcomes. More importantly, you would have the freedom to pursue the kind of groundbreaking work you clearly excel at, with full company support for patent applications and academic publication. The room around Eleanor seemed to spin slightly, and she realized she had been holding her breath. $200,000, enough to not only resolve their financial difficulties, but to provide genuine security for both herself and her father. More than that, the opportunity to return not just to her field, but to the forefront of it, with resources she had never dreamed of accessing. Yet even as the magnitude of the offer sank in, Eleanor found herself thinking not of herself, but of the men around her who had, over the course of the afternoon, transformed from dismissive competitors into colleagues worthy of respect. Davidson, whose classical approach had genuine merit despite its limitations. Peterson, whose collaborative instincts and hybrid methodology showed exceptional promise. Richardson, whose mathematical insights, while incomplete, revealed depth and creativity. Mr. Blackstone, she said carefully, your offer is extraordinarily generous, and I am deeply grateful for your recognition of my work. However, I wonder if I might make a counter-proposal. Mr. Blackstone's eyebrows rose in surprise, though his expression remained attentive. Please, continue. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to suggest might seem presumptuous, yet feeling compelled by a conviction that had been growing throughout the afternoon. What I accomplished today was significant, but it was built upon foundations laid by others and enhanced by perspectives gained through collaboration. Mr. Peterson's hybrid approach addresses practical concerns that my theoretical framework might overlook. Mr. Davidson's focus on maintainability and debugging represents crucial considerations for real-world implementation. Mr. Richardson's mathematical insights could inform future research directions. She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected curiosity, wariness, and in some cases, hope. Rather than a single research division headed by one individual, Might I suggest the formation of an advanced algorithms research team? With shared leadership and collaborative structure, the most significant breakthroughs often emerge from the intersection of different perspectives and approaches. The silence that followed this suggestion seemed to stretch indefinitely. Eleanor could see Mr. Blackstone weighing her words, his expression revealing the rapid calculations of a man accustomed to making complex decisions quickly. Around the table, the programmers waited with visible tension, their futures hanging in the balance of his response. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "your proposal demonstrates exactly the sort of strategic thinking and collaborative leadership that I hope to find in today's exercise. Very well. You shall head a 5-person advanced algorithms research team with Messrs. Peterson, Davidson, and Richardson serving as senior researchers, along with 1 additional member to be selected from our current staff." He turned to address the room as a whole. "Gentlemen, Miss Hartwell has not only solved our challenge, but has demonstrated the grace to share her success with others. I trust you will prove worthy of her confidence and her generosity." Eleanor felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Not only had she achieved more than she had ever dared to hope, but she had done so in a way that honored the genuine talents of her competitors and created opportunities for them as well. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone," she managed, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "I believe we will accomplish extraordinary things together." Indeed. As the meeting concluded and the programmers began to file out of the conference room, each stopping to offer congratulations and express eager anticipation for their future collaboration, Eleanor found herself thinking of her father, waiting at home for news of her day. She would have quite a story to tell him about the delivery girl who had ventured into the realm of algorithms and emerged not only victorious, but transformed. Mr. Davidson approached her last, his expression serious. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I want you to know that what you did today, including me in your proposal despite my earlier behavior, that took real character. I won't forget it, and I'll do everything in my power to prove worthy of the opportunity you've given me." Eleanor smiled, extending her hand to shake his. "Mr. Davidson," she replied, "I believe our best work lies ahead of us. Together, we're going to change how the world thinks about optimization problems." As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the gleaming offices of Meridian Technologies, no longer as a delivery girl, but as the head of their most innovative research division, Eleanor reflected on the curious paths that life sometimes takes. 6 years ago, circumstances had forced her away from the world of advanced algorithms and complex mathematical problems. Today, those same forces had carried her back, not to the position she had once hoped to achieve, but to something far beyond her original dreams. The rain had stopped while she worked, and evening sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting everything in golden hues. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of building a research team that could tackle the most challenging problems in distributed computing. Tonight, she would go home to her father with news that would change both their lives forever. She had come here to deliver lunch. She was leaving with the opportunity to deliver the future. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Eleanor Hartwell, no longer just a delivery girl, but a leader, an innovator, a woman who had proved that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places, smiled at her reflection in the polished steel doors. Sometimes, she thought, the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of courage, the willingness to accept a challenge, to demonstrate one's capabilities, and to treat others with the respect and dignity that all human beings deserve, regardless of their circumstances or presumptions. The doors opened with a soft chime, and Eleanor stepped out into the marble lobby, her delivery uniform marking her as someone heading home after an honest day's work. What it could not reveal was that she carried with her the promise of tomorrow, for herself, for her colleagues, and for an industry that had just witnessed the emergence of something genuinely extraordinary. Behind her, 32 floors above, a conference room stood empty, except for the lingering echoes of transformation and the memory of an afternoon when assumptions were shattered, talents were recognized, and the future took on an entirely new shape.